right. All right, well, we're back to wrapping up Lamentations. And let's turn to the very end of Lamentations, and we'll see how it ends with a kind of a short prayer, or kind of a prayer of faith, I'd call it, from the prophet. Beginning in verse 19 in chapter 5, Thou, O Lord, dost rule, or you rule forever. Your throne is from generation to generation. We hear a little bit of some glimpses there in terms of the day of the Lord language. And what about God as king? When will God come back and rule as king? Well, it's coming. And for the faithful remnant who have been raptured, they're no longer here. They're all gone. They know full well of the fullness of, hey, there's the faithful remnant. I thought maybe you all had been raptured, with that the Lord actually came back and brought you home, Okay. So we see. So the Lord rules forever. Your throne, O Lord, is from generation to generation. Why do you forget us forever? Why do you forsake us so long? Restore us then to thee, Lord. We know who you are. We know your promises, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old. Unless you've utterly rejected us, which we know isn't true, and art exceedingly angry with us. It kind of ends on a Debbie Downer, but I think it's kind of there as almost rhetorical, as a pastor would do, asking a question. It's got an obvious opposite answer. It's not, no, the Lord's not rejected us forever. He's working on our behalf. Don't you remember what I would call the pinnacle of the book of Lamentations there, what we looked at there in chapter 3. That's kind of the center point, verse 19. It turns then, and the prophet encourages the faithful remnant with that message of who is the Lord and what has he promised. All right, let's transition now to the prophet Ezekiel. All right, I know this is kind of hard to see. It's a little bit sketchy there, wavy. But what I'm trying to do here is show you a little bit of the intersection of the prophet Ezekiel, who's in the blue, in the timeline there in terms of BC years. They're just past 600 BC, so about 592 all the way up to about 572 is that timeline for the active prophet, the active ministry of Ezekiel. And there on the middle part, we see Judah's kings. Right after Josiah's reform, we have bad king, and then the Babylonian exile. Right in the midst of that, remember we've just looked at Jeremiah and highlighted in red. So really, it's overlapping with Ezekiel. This is the main thrust of what I want you to see here. Right on top of the events leading to the destruction of Jerusalem, which happens in 587, 586 BC, at the same time that Jeremiah is facing his imprisonment, ending up at the bottom of a well or in the stockades, being whipped, and then finally hogtied and taken to Egypt. Right parallel to that whole time and all those events, we've got Ezekiel also active as a prophet, speaking to the exiles back in Babylon, and in some ways hearing of the events that are going on back home in Jerusalem, as we'll see, and reporting to the exiles what's happening back home and interpreting it and offering his theological overlay as well with regards to his message. So all of this is going on in the prophet. So if this is true for the prophet Ezekiel, we would expect to see some of these elements as possible ways of organizing and structuring the phases of his message. And that's exactly what we see. This is kind of a busy slide, but it shows you, I like this because it kind of goes from the inward and then eventually to the outward and onward focus of the prophet Ezekiel. So in terms of the chapters, we've got 24 chapters that are really all about the events leading up to Jerusalem and its fall. So that shows you that there's a prophet who's active. Even though he's in Babylon, he's hearing back and reporting to the exiles on the events that are happening back home in Jerusalem. And then he's right on top of announcing the fall of Jerusalem to the exiles. And hopefully we'll get that far tonight because I I've got something that was an insight that I checked around with a few people, and nobody's really said, I don't really have ever heard that before. So it could be heresy, or it could be something that's helpful from God's Word. So I know, no, I'll keep you in suspense. But then like what we've seen before, we saw, like, remember when we had our discussion on the 3 Isaiahs? And the third Isaiah, so-called third Isaiah, chapter 56 through 66, has that future, far-reaching focus. That we gave Isaiah permission to be an active prophet, hear from the Lord, and have that prediction ministry. What's God's agenda for God's people? Way down. So that's exactly what we see here with the last portion of Ezekiel 33 through 48. Those last few chapters are all about the future or the onward, talking about restoration, and again, repeating, as we'd expect, some of the same kinds of things what we've seen before with any of the other prophets who have said anything about the day of the Lord. What's going to happen on the day of the Lord? What's God going to do when He comes back, when the Messiah comes back, with regards to the kingdom and the temple, and what's He going to do to God's people? All of these things. The prophet Ezekiel, he's going to have some words to speak on with regards to that. So for you all, the message will be the same. You all, faithful remnant, who aren't really listening right now. I'm just kidding. You're looking down at something. Yeah. You're all having a good old time over here. But yeah, Ezekiel's going to have a positive message and an encouraging message for you, promise for the future and hope. So restoration is coming. But you all feel like you're this guy. Yeah. You're still not quite, maybe you've heard the message, it's starting to trickle in, but you're feeling like this guy because for all practical purposes, you've ceased to exist as a nation because you've lost your king, you've lost your temple, you've lost your city, you've lost your land, and you've lost now your identity has been kind of pretty much squashed in Babylonian captivity. So, like what we said before, Ezekiel the prophet is going to be part of the second deportation in 597 BC. So back on that chart, it kind of correlates with this time, right in and around there. Ezekiel's going to be going back and starting up and revving up his preaching ministry about 4 years in to the Babylonian captivity. And that's kind of a general. We've got some dating clues here in the text that give us that idea about when Ezekiel starts to preach. He's got a prophetic career that's going to last about 20 years. So that's the basic length there of the blue line below in that slide. And Daniel, as I said before, was part of the first deportation. We'll start visiting him next week. And like Ezekiel, Daniel's going to be a prophet that also gets his start during the Babylonian captivity, and also will extend into the Persian captivity. So he'll be kind of a special ops prophet, I'll call him, behind the scenes. He's not involved in any of the groups that go back. So he's going to even overlap the period that we have with Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. He'll be working behind the scenes, well into his elderly years. I mean, he's active as a prophet well into his 80s. So, which is pretty amazing in those days. All right. So Ezekiel is going to be the pastor to the exiles in Babylon. He's going to be helping them through their grief. But he's also going to be active as a prophet for you all. In terms of trying to get your spiritual attention and get you turned in the right direction with regards to repentance. And a lot of you are going to respond. It's just going to, over 20 years, this group over here will start to grow in size, which is the amazing thing that it does. So that's what we have with the kind of the big picture of the prophet Ezekiel. Let's see. I mean, some of the political situation back home, after Ezekiel leaves Jerusalem and thereabouts, there's still people back home who are hopeful and expectant that maybe by some miracle of God, the Egyptians will rise up and take out the Babylonians. The Babylonian threat, the pressure's starting. Maybe those Egyptians, they'll be our friends. Political alliances and all those things. And, Ezekiel and Jeremiah are going to have the same basic response to that scenario. The answer is no. That's ridiculous. We can't depend on another nation to protect us unless it's the Lord's will. Our job is to depend on the Lord. And whatever He tells us to do, that's God's plan A for our life. So Ezekiel and Jeremiah will both have this unified front against that idea. See, Jeremiah is going to be the one who's going to prophesy that the exile will have a cap. It's going to be a 70-year period, as we saw. But over that period, but that message will be delivered to two different groups. So again, I come back to Ezekiel's job is to preach to you all. He'll have something to say to you, and then something a lot different to say to you. In fact, we'll see Ezekiel in terms of, if you study him as a preacher, it's an interesting study. Or if you look at the prophets as a preacher would, and you see their rhetorical strategy with the words that they use, how they describe things, and with Ezekiel, of more than any of the other prophets, this idea of the sign act. In other words, he has his message for the day, but he also does something to kind of be a walking billboard for the message. Kind of like what we saw with Hosea and Gomer, the naming of his kids. I kind of turned that up with the idea of writing their names on T-shirts and sitting them down in the First Baptist Church of, whatever, in Samaria and all of that. But Ezekiel's going to have and pull out all the stops to try to get the attention of you all. Pretty graphically sometimes with regards to the words that he uses and the images that he paints. We'll get into that. Some of you will cover your ears and run out of the room, so we'll just wait to see what happens. But he's got to deal with both. So it's an interesting study if you ever want to study the book of Ezekiel from that vantage point. How do you address two groups of people in the same church? That's an interesting question, and somebody can write a dissertation on that one someday. But these are the questions that are being raised by this group of people, maybe both groups together. Maybe you aren't so concerned with this question, but do we have a future? This is one of the questions, One of the questions that's interesting that comes out of this period would be, who represents true Israel? So is it you guys that obeyed and went into exile because you heard the message of Jeremiah to say go? Well, what about the people who were left behind, who chose to stay behind, and the poorest of the poor? You'll meet up with them eventually when we get back, when you come back to rebuild the walls and the temple and all of that. You'll meet up with them, and you won't have any kind words to say to that group. So it's interesting. That's one of the questions. And more so, we'll see this, probably more so than any of the other prophets. Where is the Lord's hand in all of this? How does the Lord feel? If we're even given permission to understand how God would feel about the situation. There's some very raw emotional points in the message of the book of Ezekiel that we'll get to. What about the temple or tabernacle? This is the place where the Lord meets up with us. We had a temple at one time. Now it's been ransacked and destroyed. So what about the temple? Ezekiel's got a lot of chapters dedicated to describing a temple, believe it or not, in his book. So we'll get to that as well. All right, well, let's dive in here. We've got a little, thankfully, kind of a minimal scholarly discussion, critical scholar. We always have our critical scholarly discussion with some of these books. But thankfully, with Ezekiel, there's not as many critical issues that critical scholars raise. In fact, there's a strong basis for recognizing, if not the entire book, and attributing to a single mind, that is, the prophet Ezekiel himself, with a lot of scholars. And this is one of them here, Walter Zimmerli. He produced perhaps the definitive work on Ezekiel in his 2-volume Hermenia series, his commentary. It's very helpful, very insightful. He's basically interesting. He follows what we talked about is called the redactional critical approach. As a redaction scholar, these guys would recognize what would be recognized as what you'd call the core of the book, which would be attributed to the prophet. But what Zimmerli argues for, or tries to bring up, well, first of all, the critical scholars will want to talk about, for Ezekiel's situation, a school or Ezekielian school. In other words, students or other prophets who are understudies of Ezekiel. So Ezekiel, primary prophet, the core, and then this school kind of follows up after Ezekiel and comes up with some additional, what would be called expansions and narrative expansions that were added later, not attributed to the prophet himself. So we've seen that before. We talked about a school or a Deuteronomic school that would have been responsible for some of the additional material in Isaiah. We argued against that, and for this reason, and Zimmerli, of all scholars, he argues against the this kind of idea, this school idea for the prophet Ezekiel. So it's interesting. So generally across the board, critical scholars have been the most generous with regards to Ezekiel in terms of attributing the book to the prophet himself. So that's, the school idea Zimmerli here argues against. He suggests, basically makes the case that it's very difficult to read a book like Ezekiel and figure out or try to make a determination at all of what belongs to Ezekiel and what belongs to a school. It's just impossible. There's such continuity and seamless continuity in terms of the reading of the book and the theology that is leaping off the page. So it's very difficult to discern. So basically they side, and even Walter Zimmerli suggests that even the prophet himself could have been responsible for the final editing of his own book. Sometimes the redaction scholars will say, yeah, there's some final editors who come along and tidy things up and maybe insert a few additional things. But not in the case of the book of Ezekiel. It's just from start to finish, it just seems to be one unified whole. All right, so enough of that. We move on to the basic chunks, the primary organization. We saw that chart before, and we saw that the first 24 chapters, if you remember, are going to focus on what's happening in Jerusalem, what's leading up to the eventual fall of Jerusalem. So that's the large portion. So all the way up to the actual historical event, which overlapped with Jeremiah, and we'll see in Ezekiel is overlapping as well. Also, we're going to have, as similar as what we've seen with all of the prophets, some concern for the nations in international justice or injustice, so chapters 25 through 32, judgments against some of the foreign nations around. So again, that's a reminder of God's concern for the nations. And then the last portion that I referred to earlier is that future restoration promise. What's going to happen for a unified Israel, the restoration of God's people in a particular place, Jerusalem, as well as lots of things to say about a temple, and all of that would have been encouraging to the faithful remnant. It's interesting that Ezekiel spends a lot of time talking about the temple and God's concern for the temple, the future temple, but it's you guys that leave Babylon with this vision for rebuilding the temple. The one that's, the one on terra firma, the one that's on, going to be in Jerusalem. So you're riding on the backs of this prophetic encouragement for God's concern for their temple. You've got you might say, the spiritual blueprint and reason for, and the motivation for going back and rebuilding the temple. So it all comes from Ezekiel. It fits in really nicely with what we see that's happened in history. All right, so let's keep moving here. What's unique also about the prophet Ezekiel is how close the message is to his personal life as a prophet. We're going to see some very personal, up close and personal things with regards to Ezekiel and how he becomes the embodiment of the message that he's delivering to the exiles in Babylon. And we get the sense, I'll just jump to a few interesting texts, like chapter 3, verse 16. Now it came about at the end of the 7 days that the word of the Lord came to me, saying, there's a lot of that emphasis on the active prophet hearing from the Lord. I just heard from the Lord, now I'm speaking to y'all. That kind of activity. In chapter 3, we see some evidence of that. We're going to see this a little bit later on. In the 9th year of his ministry, Ezekiel is going to lose his wife, the loss of the death of his wife, and will be stricken as dumb for a period of time. And a lot of sign acts he's involved in. So let's get into the message. And here in chapter 1, let's turn back there. Have you ever read chapter 1 before? Yeah, it's kind of unique, isn't it? It kind of strums up. I did a Google search on Ezekiel chapter 1, and it's amazing what you get with the image search. Make sure you put it on safe zone. But you get a lot of things like this. So it's interesting, the first chapter in Ezekiel, people out there in the world read it and get really excited, especially people who maybe have a close affinity to Roswell, and some of those things like, first encounter of the third kind. So let's just remind ourselves of there. Yeah. Is this Ezekiel's vision? That's a classic movie. Independence Day. Yeah, it's an old school movie, but it's a good movie. You can watch it if your dad gives you permission to. So let's take a look at the message here in chapter 1. Let's see here. Ann Merritt, I would like you to start reading here in chapter. So now let's get into a little bit of his chapter 1 vision, starting in chapter 1, verse 4.
As I looked, behold, a stormy wind came out of the north, and a great cloud with brightness around it, and fire flashing forth continually, and in the midst of the fire, as it were gleaming metal. And from the midst of it came the likeness of 4 living creatures, and this was their appearance. They had a human likeness, but each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the sole of a calf's foot, and they sparkled like burnished bronze. Under their wings, on their 4 sides, they had human hands. And the 4 had their faces and their wings thus. Their wings touched one another. Each one of them went straight forward, without turning as they went. As for the likeness of their faces, each had a human face. The 4 had the face of a lion on the right side, the 4 had the face of an ox on the left side, and the 4 had the face of an eagle.
Okay.
For their faces.
Yeah, that's interesting. He's getting this vision, and it's lots of various images that are all kind of blending together. Different animal faces, animal parts, winged creatures, hoofed creatures. Some human-like aspects of the same vision. All blended together. Sounds like a bad nightmare, you had recently. Derek, could you read for us verses 13 through 16?
The appearance of the living creatures was like burning coals of fire, or like torches. Fire moved back and forth among the creatures. It was bright, and lightning flashed out of it. The creatures sped back and forth like flashes of lightning. As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the ground beside each creature with its 4 faces. This was the appearance of the structure of the wheels. They sparkled like topaz, and all 4 looked alike. Each appeared to be made like a wheel intersecting a wheel.
Okay, down through verse 16. Good. That's kind of the description there. That portion of the vision probably gives us the inspiration for this kind of thing. There's the UFO portion, and whatever the figures were inside the wheels and the discs moving around, and you've got all this kind of straight line motion going on. But is it, did we just stop there, let the UFO advocates win with regards to their interpretation of Ezekiel 1? No, 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 no. Let's let some wisdom from archaeology help us a little bit, perhaps, with what might be going on here. I think that there's some prophetic, I think this is an old school prophet / pastor at work, getting the attention of his audience in a very, very unique but very effective way. So what you see here, pictured here, on the very top row are images. These images are, in this particular case, the three major gods of Mesopotamia on the top row. Second row, these are the gods of war, the deities of war. The third row, the major gods of Babylon. So, interestingly, Marduk, the chief deity, here is represented by the dragon in this triangular shape over there on the far left. The fourth row down, with the bull and the altar with the forked lightning, represents the Babylonian god Adad. The fifth row, very bottom row, I think that's what it is, there is Nisava, the corn goddess of the Babylonians. These are Babylonian gods, Mesopotamian gods, all mixed together. And this is an image that would have been on Main Street, Babylon, carved in a temple wall or some, it would have been on a billboard of the day, describing very common imagery that would have been readily accessible and probably quite prominent in ancient Babylon. So Ezekiel's vision here describes faces of a man, lion, bull, and eagle, and all of this. Basically, what Ezekiel's vision is capturing here is the composite deity, half man, half animal, winged, feet of calves, and all of this stuff that you see here in chapter 1. These are composite deities. Ezekiel begins his prophetic ministry with a message of pagan imagery and gods, little g gods, the kind that you would have seen downtown Babylon on every billboard in the busy city. So why is Ezekiel doing this? How would Ezekiel's audience have responded with this message? What do you think?
Well, he knew exactly what he was doing. Like, whoa, they think he's taking shots at us.
Possibly one response. Is Ezekiel kind of poking fun at the pagan gods of the Babylonians? Well, that's possible. I'm also thinking of some other possibilities of, remember the spiritual condition that they were in, you all over here? Not the faithful remnant, but you all over here. What were you doing back home in Jerusalem before you went into exile? Come on, it's time to fess up. What were you doing? Yeah, you were half-baked pagan. You were into your pagan images, sacrificing to the queen of heaven and all that stuff, baking raisin cakes, whatever those things are, and having a little backyard pagan picnic. I can just go on and on. So these images possibly poking fun at the Babylonians, but also making the majority of unfaithful very comfortable and at home. Maybe your all's response is, oh, we're quite comfortable. This is a suit. It fits us well. Look at Ezekiel. He's acknowledging the Godhead of the Babylonians, and we're going to become quite familiar with this group now that we'll have church here in Babylon for a while. We can't wait to get started. Thank you, Ezekiel. Something like that. Now I'm filling in some blanks here. I'm just speculating. Or thank you, Ezekiel, for a vivid picture of the pagan gods to be worshipped now that we're in Babylon. We'll just keep right on going down this path. Like the group that goes to Egypt. See what they were bent on doing, right? They went to Egypt and they fit right into ongoing pagan culture. These are images that we're remembering from back home. These are the images that we adopted and kind of brought in. And when we were having church, talking about God and talking about some of these other gods. Thanks for making us feel comfortable, Ezekiel. You're a great pastor. No, and he's not done. So Ezekiel continues on with this message. And we get something else. Beginning in verse 22. So this is the ongoing sermon. This is prophetic preaching, and beginning in verse 22, the prophet pauses, and then he goes into a different tone, and he says, "Now over the heads of the living beings there was something like an expanse, like the awesome gleam of crystal extended over their heads," meaning all that he's just described. "And under the expanse their wings were stretched out straight, one toward the other. Each also had 2 wings covering their bodies on one side and the other. I also heard the sound of their wings, like the sound of abundant waters as they went, like the voice of El Shaddai, a sound of tumult, like the sound of an army camp whenever they stood still. They dropped their wings, and there came a voice from above the expanse that was over their heads wherever they stood still when they dropped their wings. Now above the expanse that was over their heads was something like resembling a throne, like lapis lazuli in appearance, and on that which resembled a throne high up was a figure with the appearance of a man. Then I noticed from the appearance of his loins and upwards something like glowing metal that looked like fire all around within it. And from the appearance of his loins and downward I saw something like fire, and there was a radiance around him, as the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day. So is the appearance of the surrounding radiance. Such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord, capital Lord. And when I saw it, I fell on my face and heard a voice speaking. And I suggest that all of us do the same. He had a stare-down competition for the rest of the church hour, waiting for a response. Anybody want to come to the altar? See what he's doing here? He's just started with the common, what you all expecting. Well, it's pagan gods and all this, but I remember the Lord. Yeah, back when I was young, we used to go to Grandma's church, and they'd sing those old Baptist hymns and talk about the Lord. And I remember that way back when, in the early days of my childhood. Ezekiel, you're reminding me of something that I have kind of forgotten. Oh, God's on his throne. The Lord Yahweh, the one that Moses reminded us of, who's sitting on his throne, and that's Sunday School 101. Well, that's where the prophet Ezekiel is going back to. Let's go back to the basics. Let's start with God. Who is he? Where is he? And what is he doing? He's on his throne. So it's time to get our hearts right. He's laying this foundation. So that's something that he's doing from the very, very get-go. He's starting with the majority, not you all over here, but you are all encouraged by this message, by the way. But everybody over here, wow, this is a heavy message. God's on his throne. Maybe I ought to reconnect with the God who, the one who made all those promises to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and King David and some of those covenants and all that. This is where he's going. All right. So, Ezekiel 2 and 3, we've got Ezekiel's calling, his prophetic call. We saw this with Isaiah and some of the other prophets that were called. Let's go to Seth back here and meet up with Ezekiel, the called prophet, in chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. Got it?
And he said to me, Son of man, stand on your feet, and I will speak with you. And he spoke to me. The Spirit entered into me and set me on my feet. And I heard him speaking to me. And he said to me, Son of man, I send you to the people of Israel, to nations of rebels who have rebelled against me. They and their fathers have transgressed against me to this very day. The descendants also are imputed and impotent, and stubborn. I send you to them, and you shall say to them, Thus says the Lord God.
All right, let's just pause there. The reason I love this call passage or this call narrative so much is you see that, like what we saw with Isaiah and even Moses, who was called. But here it's interesting. With the call also comes the "Thus saith the Lord." You see that in verse 4. I'm sending you to them, this group over here. Who are they? Well, they're stubborn and obstinate children But here's what you shall say to them. The Lord says to the prophet Ezekiel, thus says the Lord. So it's that authority, right, that the prophet receives with his call. You're called to a ministry, you're called to a flock. It should come with, and you got to make sure you know that it comes with, thus saith the Lord. You're speaking for the Lord. You're representing him with whatever congregation you're called to. In this case, a pretty high calling, tough job assignment for Ezekiel the prophet to start with this, but it's wrapped up in his call. All right, so what's his first sign act? He starts right in. Remember the sign act, that's the idea that comes with the message, some activity or some kind of walking billboard type of experience that the prophet has to highlight and bring emphasis to his message. Chapter 3, verse 1 through 4. Let's have Oleinka. Could you read for us in chapter 3, verse 1 through 4?
Moreover, he said unto me, Son of man, eat that thou findest, eat this scroll, and go speak unto the house of Israel. So I opened my mouth, and it caused me to eat the roll. He said unto me, Son of man, cause thy belly to eat, and fill thy bowel with this roll that I give thee. Then did I eat it? It was in my mouth as honey for sweetness. And he said unto me, Son of man, go, get thee unto the house of Israel. Speak with my words.
It's an interesting sign act. I mean, you can always play this, the critical scholarly game and say, well, did he actually eat a scroll? What if he did? Right? What kind of impact would that have had with this, with his sermon, his message? Where else have we heard something significantly said about, it's not about bread, but it's about words? Right? You remember? It's back to the lesson of the wilderness. I'll just go back to Deuteronomy chapter 8. Moses had this same vantage point when he was unpacking the theology of the exile for his group that came out of the 40-year period, and they needed to be kind of given a postscript. Here's what we should have here's our walk away from the exile experience in the wilderness. You shall remember all the way which the Lord your God has led you in the wilderness these 40 years, that he might humble you. He tested you. He refined you so that he would know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And he humbled you. He let you be hungry. He fed you with your manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you understand. What? Man doesn't live by bread alone. Man lives by everything that proceeds, every word that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord. So if the connection can be made between Moses' Deuteronomy 8 reflection on not eating bread but eating words, you see the connection there? There might be a connection there. I don't know. What do you think, John? You think I'm onto something? That's not the deep insight that I think might be heretical. This is just letting the text speak. But I think the interesting connection can be made between Moses' post-wilderness experience generation and the generation that Ezekiel starts to speak to, right? The new generation that's gone into the Babylonian exile, they need to be reminded of this lesson, I think.
I think your slide should have a guy with a fortune cookie in it.
He's like a little box of Nabiscos or something. Yeah, eating the word. Fortune cookie. I've done that before. You're supposed to eat your fortune and it makes it even come true or something, so to speak. I don't know. It's just a piece of paper. But not on bread alone, but on every word that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord. So that, that's the picture of obedience. Learning fidelity, learning faithfulness, learning to trust in the Lord. Baby steps at first, and that's the whole thing that we saw when we, back in OT1, that was the experience of Israel in the early days. But how far has she gone? Guess what? You've got to relearn that. So life in Babylon's going to be like the life in the wilderness, learning to trust in the Lord and hearing from him. It's eating the words, right? So exile for 70 years, it's going to be the same lesson. Well, let's keep going here, and this is why Ezekiel is so much fun, because there's so much vivid color in his message, and you see these surprising and sometimes shocking sign acts. Let's finish this one and we'll take our break. So now we have 4 additional symbolic actions that will bring some understanding in vivid ways of the coming siege of Jerusalem and its final destruction. So Ezekiel is going to start in chapter 4. Let's turn there. And we see the siege predicted here in the first 8 verses. Let's have Bridget. I haven't had you read yet. Let's read chapter 4, verses 1 down through 8.
And you, son of man, take a brick and lay it before you, and engrave on it a city, even Jerusalem, and put siege works against it, and build a siege wall against it, and cast up a mound against it. Set camps also against it, and plant battering rams against it all around. And you, take an iron girdle, and place it as an iron wall between you and the city, and set your face toward it, and let it be in the state of siege, and press the siege against it. This is the sign for the house of Israel. Then lie on your left side, and place the punishment of the house of Israel upon it. For the number of the days that you lie on it, you shall bear their punishment. For I assign to you a number of days, 390 days, equal to the number of years of their punishment. So long shall you bear the punishment of the house of Israel. And when you have completed these, you shall lie down a second time, but on your right side, and bear the punishment of the house of Judah. 40 days I assign you, a day for each year. And you shall set your face toward the siege of Jerusalem, with your arm bared, and you shall prophesy against the city. And behold, I will place cords upon you, so that you cannot turn from one side to the other, till you have completed the days of your siege.
Okay. I get this, you know. When I was a kid, probably like you, you know, I was into like those little miniature soldiers, those little plastic about an inch high, and also the little tiny ones. But my mom loved me as a kid because I'd go out and I'd have my old school wood blocks, those ones that are red, yellow, green, and blue, and I'd set up castles and you know, I have castles and I have the soldiers on the inside, the soldiers on the outside, and I'd set up sieges. And I would literally, in my mind, I'd have this whole afternoon set aside to setting up the war plan with my 2 armies that are combating each other. I had World War II soldiers, I had Civil War soldiers, Revolutionary War soldiers, knights and Vikings. I had complete sets of these soldiers. I just set up scenarios and campaigns. And in my mind, everything was moving. But I just moved one soldier at a time, like a kind of a chess match. And by the end of the 3 or 4 hours, I have entertained myself. My mom didn't have to worry about me. And I grew up most of my early childhood as an extreme introvert because I didn't go out and play with my friends, and I dare not let any of them come in and play this game with me because they didn't know how to do it like me. I had this imagination for this. I was like, oh, wow, you know. So I can get this. You know, he's got this preaching ministry. Hey, what's going on back home? Why don't you come down here and I'll show you this little miniature siege setup. And for quite a number of days, to be fact. In fact, this involved, I would say, Ezekiel's personal suffering and misery, being bound, not allowed to move very far, and have basically the same message to anybody walking by. What's he doing? Hey, what are you doing over there? Oh, siege back home. Have you heard? You know, this is kind of the bad news for the exiles, but for you all here, you know, who have been taken into Babylonian captivity, what about the people who are inside the walled city? That's kind of what I'm feeling like right now, says the prophet Ezekiel. It's not very comfortable. So in fact, there's more to say about what's going on inside the walled city. All right, I'm going to get you guys. I don't know what the joke is back there. How about this? I'm going to have, okay, Ben, I'm going to have you read now. Dry your eyes. Chapter 4, verse 9. More information about the siege. You got it?
Also take wheat, barley, beans, lentils, millet, and spelt. Put them in a single container and make them into bread for yourself. You are to eat it during the number of days you lie on your side, 390 days. The food you eat each day will be 8 ounces by weight. You will eat it from time to time. You are also to drink water by measure, 1/6 of a gallon. which you will drink from time to time.
Okay, thank you, Ezekiel. I get it. So when you're in a siege and you're on the inside of the walled city, you've got to ration food. Water, food, the grain to bake your bread, and all of this. Yeah, we've got to measure it out. And yeah, so that's what's going on back home. Big deal. They're going to make it. God's not going to let them, get sick and perish. I mean, they're just going to have their siege strategy under some good leadership of the king, and everything will be fine and dandy. Oh, wait a minute. So there's more that you have to say, Ezekiel? Go ahead.
You will eat it as much. You will eat it as you would a barley cake, and bake it over dry human excrement in their sight. The Lord said.
What did you just say? You said a bad word. We don't say that word in our family. What'd you say?
Fecal matter.
Oh, that's even worse. Now you're getting medical on me. That's what a nurse would say. Something else? Human dung. Wow. All right, what's the picture? Yeah, it's not very pretty. Thanks, Ezekiel, for that happy message today. I'm not going to be able to forget that image in my mind. So what you're telling me, Ezekiel, is back home, things have gotten so desperate inside the walled city of Jerusalem. Look, you were baking your bread with firewood. Okay. You run out of wood. You got to have something to make the fire. But the second thing that you can do is use animal feces, which was dry, becomes really good. It burns quick, it's efficient, it's not quite according to laws of clean and unclean in our community, but we've got to have a way of cooking our food. But after a long time of siege, we've eaten all of our animals. We've run out of animal dung. What are we going to use now to build our fires? See, things have gotten a little bit desperate. So this isn't just wasted, words. This is creating this scene of the desperation of siege and what's going on back home. And for you all, you could have very well been there yourselves, So we need to get our hearts right over here. You guys, what the Lord is doing back home is judgment. Why? Judgment because they're all back there thinking that the Lord's going to protect them and provide for them under the false pretenses of their false prophets who are giving them this message of, as we'll see in Ezekiel, false security. But really what has to happen is their hearts need to change, and that's not happened. But it's going to happen to you all now that I've got your attention, see? So it's kind of like that. You could do this once. I didn't quite go this far as a youth pastor. I've told you my crazy youth pastor stories, right? The things that got me fired in youth ministry. In the farming community in Northwest Ohio, one of the things I did do was actually bring in some dried animal dung into the youth group and brought it in and plopped it right down there, right in the middle of the floor when I was teaching from this passage, and talked about the whole progression that I just shared with you from wood to dried animal dung to what's next. When you run out of this, And the kids loved it. I mean, it's one of those memorable youth messages that I gave. They always remembered that. I almost went this far. I almost used the animal dung with a hot dog barbecue and actually cooked hot dogs. Now, I would not have served them, but what I would be doing is cooking on dried animal feces, using it instead of charcoal, and cooking hot dogs with the expectation of serving them and making the point that way, but I chose not to. I probably would have gotten fired immediately from that, but anyway. It's interesting. It's interesting. What are you going to do to get the attention of your hard of hearing youth? Sometimes you can think of some creative synapse too, but maybe not that extreme. All right. Let's take a 5-minute break, and let's come back and finish for the night.
This is similar to the king's narrative. This is similar to what happened with the kings, because they were sieged with the Sennacherib crisis. They also had to resort to the same.
They had some desperation moments, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we're not through with the graphic imagery of siege. It's going to get even more intense. Yeah.
I've never read the book of Ezekiel, so.
What? Sacrilege.
Do we have a pause button?
Oh, yes, thank you. Somebody was supposed to. You guys didn't remind me about hitting the pause button. All right, good.